Let's talk briefly about the National Weather Service today. When we talk about weather, it's related to climate, but it's important to note that while weather and climate are related terms related to our atmosphere, they do differ in terms of temporal scale, scope, and variability. So weather is the short-term thing we see. Climate is the long-term average stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of the climate denialism is had detrimental impacts on our interests in monitoring the weather. So, talk about our National Weather Service. It begins before the founding of our country, actually. Our founding fathers, notably Thomas Jefferson and his atmospheric experiments, George Washington and a lot of his data tracking with thermometers and tracking humidity and stuff. They were very avid weather observers. That would sort of more or less go on unchanged until we see the invention of the telegraph in the mid 1800s. And when the telegraph comes along, we start to, for the first time, have the ability to integrate weather observations from different locations collected at the same point in time. Such that by 1849, the Smithsonian Institution had begun the first proto-weather observation network and had an extensive group of folks around the country beginning to collect data daily. As we get towards the latter 1800s, we have a series of storms that sink several hundred boats across the Great Lakes over winter storms. And the Great Lakes are so large they actually behave almost like the ocean in terms of large waves, etc. And so Congress decides that we really need a better way to monitor, predict wind, storm activity, etc. So we passed this congressional resolution in 1870 to charge the Army with some integrated monitoring. And so that begins the process of military bases beginning to collect weather data. So this first entity is known as the Division of Telegrams and Reports for the Benefit of Commerce, domiciled under the Army Signal Services Corps. And on November 1st, 1870, that group of folks, those so-called observer sergeants, start to make their first systemic observations, and we've been going strong ever since. First, we start to collect data on weather, and then because we have this sort of integrated telegraph system, we can start to think about very nascent forecasting. So that forecasting would be if I was in Chicago and telegraphed over to, say, Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. was having a storm that was moving westward, we could have some initial estimates as to maybe when that storm system would hit Chicago. Fundamentally, the telegraph was important to this, and it was basically very simplistic, and it was just, hey, what seems to be coming your way? Initially, that's all on the continent, on the 48 states, we didn't have 48 states then, but on the continental landmass of North America. And then after a bit, we begin to extend that off into the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, areas where we have a lot of commercial shipping activity. We then start to see some of the evolution of this organization, so that by 1891 we start to see we've seen more sophisticated weather instrumentation coming online and being distributed, and the weather collection activities get transitioned to the Department of Agriculture in what's then known as the Weather Bureau. Things really begin to change with the 1900 Galveston hurricane. Now, we're not naming hurricanes back then, so we call this one the 1900 Galveston hurricane. This is a reconstruction of the path and intensity of that historic hurricane. It was insane. It was crazy. It essentially wiped Galveston off the map and is the reason why now Houston is the fourth largest city in the U.S., and Houston is the sort of business capital of the state of Texas. It was a Category 4 hurricane that would strike the island of Galveston just off the mainland of Texas. With the exception of diseases, is the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Killed somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people. Most of those people died because of storm surge. In the aftermath of the Galveston hurricane, the public was really angry. They felt very uninformed, and they thought that the warnings from our nascent weather monitoring systems were very vague, and they were very ineffective. As the storm, you can see the storm here, moves across Cuba, the Cuban authorities were communicating some concern over the strength of the storm, but the Americans didn't believe it. That was relating to a lot of geopolitical tension, a lot of sort of scientific arrogance and competition, and basically was just very poor. We could have very likely saved more people if we had heeded the data that was coming out of Cuba. And so all that public, all that media critique leads to a backlash and causes an institutional review and causes us to rejigger much of the weather monitoring efforts. That really erodes a lot of institutional trust that existed in the weather collection efforts in the U.S., and that redoubles the interest in detailed forecasting, detailed communication, and really the infrastructure that would support both of those things. And so, for example, what we see in the wake of the Galveston hurricane is a huge increase in what becomes our modern coastal warning system, and a new array of hurricane signal stations or hurricane monitoring stations that can forward hurricane information to other regions before the storm arrives there. And a great increase in training in sort of essentially the modern science of meteorology, and everybody being exposed to that. And also protocol standardization for how we collect wind data, rain data, etc. It also really highlights the need for centralized, timely dissemination of data. And that really pushes us with the data infrastructure that we now have today. And then lastly, it really reinforced the important role that the federal government plays in disaster risk communication. We see this whole idea of politicization and weather being a political football at times that really gets going in and around this era as well. So what we have now is, we had 1870, we were part of the Army Signal Corps. 1891, as I mentioned before, we transfer to the Department of Agriculture. In 1940, it moves to the Department of Commerce. And that becomes turned into the National Weather Service in 1970. Also in 1970, the entity that was in charge of this weather monitoring, which was then known as the Environmental Science Services Administration, that whole thing becomes the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So in 1970, we both get a new name, National Weather Service, and the overall agency is also now named NOAA. And that's where we are today. That's where we remain today. The National Weather Service is a important chunk, a large chunk of NOAA, but it is only one component of NOAA. I need to say that. We see it primarily in a lot of these high-profile, dangerous weather conditions. For example, here, National Hurricane Center. And that data comes in from 122 different regional offices around the country, and these are the different forecasting districts across the U.S. Our own office, our own National Weather Service office, is in Oxnard. It's responsible for the Los Angeles region. It was originally based in Los Angeles from the late 1800s onward, but in 1993 we relocated from West LA to Oxnard, and we are where we are now, right next to the Procter and Gamble facility in Oxnard, just a little bit west of the Camarillo Airport, about a 16-minute drive from campus. When we go there, you should plan for about a half hour, just in case you hit some traffic. And we have our own, part of the National Weather Service website with detailed observations, predictions, forecasts for our local region in and around the greater Los Angeles area. The modern National Weather Service has all kinds of products that we interact with daily: storm forecasts, rain forecasts, drought forecasts, stuff that's really important for farmers, stuff that's really important for travelers, stuff that's really important for shipping and fishing. It just goes on and on. Most of our daily forecasts and warnings are built around safety, but they've now been integrated into huge, diverse arrays of scheduling for all manner of commercial activities. And then just, you and I use it daily when we're figuring out if we're going to go to the park today, or if we're going to go surf, or we're going to go hike, or whatever. So really integrated throughout American life. As I mentioned, we have 122 different forecasting offices that are hyper-focused on both data collection and tailoring forecasts for the local areas. And then we have some specialty things like the National Hurricane Center that focuses on a particular element of weather or climate. We also, so while there's other agencies inside NOAA that also work on climate, the National Weather Service also does a lot of the core data collection for that helps us understand long-term data monitoring and prediction of the climate. Some of those specialized services I mentioned already, but they include aviation forecasts, marine and coastal forecasts, fire weather forecast, river level or river stage and flood prediction, similarly with drought. Space weather, we don't typically think of space weather, but space weather is a thing. Tsunamis, and heat, a new experimental forecast for heat risk are some examples of the specialized services the Weather Service provides us. To do that, we have an extensive infrastructure that we use to collect data. First and foremost, a whole wide variety of sensors, from weather stations to satellites in space, balloons that we launch, all kinds of cool stuff. And then an extensive array of Doppler radar, which we use to track clouds and precipitation. And then we also have a fleet of buoys and other shipborne and floating platforms to collect oceanic data across the world's oceans. Once we get that data, we turn that data into freely available things. First and foremost, it could be just the raw data, it could be the processed data, and then it can also be the outputs of our forecasting models. Throughout all this, the core principle that has guided the National Weather Service throughout its entire history has been this idea that the data we're going to collect is a public good and is made available in the public domain for free. Today, in the modern computer world that we live in, that's made available through APIs, wherein developers that are going to create products for you, could be on your iPhone, could be for a TV forecaster, those folks can pull the data out automatically and both get either the raw data or get forecasts, or get storm or weather alerts. They also produce a bunch of geospatial products that we can also download and integrate and use. And then NOAA also operates NOAA Weather Radio, which are specific bands that are constantly broadcasting the weather conditions, and if there's a hazard, what that particular hazard is. For a long time, a joke was, late night comics and all that kind of stuff about how the weather was always a guess, and who knows if the weather was correct. We've made tremendous progress over the last 30, 40 years in terms of getting better and better with our predictive powers. So we're not just going to some crazy crystal ball reader, but we're actually building off of decades of investment, decades of very sophisticated computer simulations to get pretty darn accurate in terms of our predictions now of weather over the next few days to 5 to 6 day, 7 day predictions. Historically, as I mentioned, we did have a challenging time in figuring out how to do these predictions. And really, modern predictions were revolutionized by both satellite data and by computer processing, these atmospheric simulators. But that's also brought on this long-standing tension between this notion of weather as a public service, as a public good, and those that would seek to profit from that data, or for-profit commercial enterprises. Right now, we have an array of private weather companies that are all parameterized with the free public data. And increasingly, we're seeing more of those private weather companies argue that maybe there should be some limit on the public's access to that data. Not their access, but the public's access to that data. As I mentioned before, weather's been political for decades, and it's often an easy punching bag, as we see here from this cartoon in 1907, where a House of Representatives guy was very angry that the prediction was wrong, and he got sick. But we see the different forms of this over the years of sort of using weather as a punching bag. It's also currently in the, as we'll see in a second, in the crosshairs of those that would seek to change our government. It's important to say that in 2024, a study was done by the American Meteorological Society, and they found a return on investment for every dollar we spend on weather monitoring with the National Weather Service. That returns $73 worth of value to Americans. And if we were to add the value to people around the world, because this data is freely available to everyone, and we do a lot of global monitoring of weather conditions, it's going to be even higher than that. So it's a really fantastic return on investment for our dollars. Even though that might be true, we are, as we all know, we've now experienced increasing misinformation and increasing targeting of science and scientific data in our world that we live in now. And in the context of the National Weather Service, we're seeing a lot of growing calls for privatization of the National Weather Service and the things that the National Weather Service does. The types of general arguments that are being made are that if we were to privatize this, we'd be more quote unquote efficient, we'd reduce the costs. But in so doing there's great concern that we would see reduced public access to important safety information, first and foremost. And then, of course, there's just the whole idea of we already pay for this as taxpayers. We now have to pay for it again for this weather data. So that's a concern in terms of the privatization of the National Weather Service. And even AccuWeather, which was an organization that has argued over the years that we should privatize at least some subsection of the National Weather Service activities. Even they have expressed some opposition to 100% privatization of the National Weather Service. The recent attacks on the National Weather Service really get going really start again in the mid 90s with some legislation with the so-called contract with America, or contract on America, depending on who you talk to, was where we see the introduction of a bill in 1995 to try to dismantle the entire Department of Commerce. And because the National Weather Service is domiciled inside NOAA, which is inside the Department of Commerce, that would have in effect dismantled the National Weather Service. That fails. 20 years later, or 10 years later, excuse me, we see a similar effort brought by Senator Santorum, who introduces the National Weather Service's Duties Act, and that specifically sought to prevent the National Weather Service from providing any free weather info to the public that private companies could supply. They would still be forced to give the data to the for-profit companies, but this would have barred them from allowing the public to see that data. That, again, also failed. Then things pick up in earnest again with the first Trump administration, where we see Barry Myers, who was a former CEO of AccuWeather, of that for-profit weather organization, was nominated to lead NOAA. He ultimately was not confirmed, and he spent more than 2 years as the nominee before eventually withdrawing his nomination entirely due to significant opposition over what was seen as a pretty obvious conflict of interest. Then the massive change of Sharpiegate, which we'll talk about separately in a second, in 2019. Around this same time, Howard Lutnick, who now is our Secretary of Commerce in the second Trump administration, floated the idea of privatizing the National Weather Service when he said things like, I think we can deliver the project more efficiently and less expensively. The same quotes more or less being trumped out. Okay, so Sharpiegate 2019. This was, I cannot understate the impact of this series of events for the future of the National Weather Service. So this was this hurricane, the map you see in front of you, which was the Hurricane Dorian was coming towards Florida, and the regular cones of uncertainty were as normally modeled by the National Hurricane Center. That black thing over there was unclear at first, but now it's very clear that it was drawn on with a Sharpie by President Trump because he, for some reason, wanted to say that the people of Alabama were at risk and that apparently he was some kind of hero that would keep them safe or something. So that was all just his hand-drawn notes. That was in the Oval Office. He made this announcement, did this press conference. So September 2019, Trump talks about in the Oval Office and tweets that Alabama is facing really significant risk. He shows that map on September 4th in the Oval Office and says, here's my evidence that what I said before is true, and claims that the part with the Sharpie was the original chart and that the meteorologist had changed it after he made his statement, which was not true. So this causes a huge political uproar, and people angered that someone's trying to change the weather forecast for political reasons. So 2 days later, NOAA issues an unsigned statement, which is highly unusual. It always says who drafted it, who the administrator, who the scientist was, whatever. In this case, a letter comes out from NOAA unsigned that basically says President Trump is right and contradicts all of the meteorologists in the National Weather Service. Some people speak truth to power, they get fired. Some scientists and meteorologists basically, an investigation finds that the acting administrator of NOAA and the deputy chief of staff of NOAA were behind this unsigned missive and were violating the scientific integrity of the basic policies and the basic activities of the National Weather Service by bypassing their meteorologists and by interjecting politics into a fundamentally scientific question. A lot of fallout from Sharpie Gate, first and foremost, led to some erosion of trust, where we're seeing reduced confidence in federal weather agencies and forecasts. There was a legal violation there. It actually is illegal to alter official forecasts, which is supposed to be punishable by fines and imprisonment. But as we've seen with other situations, these folks are not held to account for their actions. And then it just really set a very dangerous precedent for politicization of science. And it really exemplified President Trump's pattern of subverting scientific consensus to really validate whatever his false claims of the day happen to be, and really foreshadow his later attacks on the National Weather Service. What happened to the folks that were main actors here promoting misinformation? Nothing is the short answer. And indeed, despite the ethics violations, Jacobs has been renominated to lead NOAA in the wake of the start of the second Trump administration, and signaling great concern for the independence of NOAA, broadly writ, not just the National Weather Service. And really, this was a landmark case of a clear executive overreach into federal science. Okay, then we have Project 2025, which was the strategizing of how to dismantle much of the federal government, spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation. In there, there's specific call-outs and specific attention devoted to NOAA and the National Weather Service. In Project 2025, NOAA is claimed or is alleged to be harmful to the future of U.S. prosperity, which is insane, and is labeled as the main driver of the climate change so-called alarm industry. And Project 2025 suggests that we should fully commercialize all forecasting operations of the National Weather Service. And it also recommends that any or just about all of NOAA's climate change research should be wholly disbanded. We see much of Project 2025 being manifest with the creation of DOGE and the dismantling of federal agencies that DOGE has embraced so gleefully. And they began ransacking NOAA in early February of 2025. Many civil society groups have asked for investigations into what DOGE is doing. These activities have been described as hacking the government and as wreaking havoc on our scientific agencies and our science collection system, our data collection systems. Referred to by some as something like a confederacy to destroy government functions, which certainly appears to be what is desired. Those actions are manifesting in the initial layoffs, but currently the much more extensive layoffs and the ones that will be much more likely to stick and not be reversible by a court order are going to come from the so-called reduction in force efforts which are going on across the federal government. And NOAA is getting ready to lay off perhaps 1,000 or if not more folks, which are primarily scientists. From the layoffs that have already happened and the cancellation of grants, etc. Commerce Secretary Lutnick recently said a couple weeks ago that the National Weather Service is now operating more efficiently and at lower cost because we've deleted some of the data collection efforts that they routinely do. They're also prepping to terminate leases early on something like 620 different NOAA facilities, many of which pertain to the National Weather Service. We're also seeing cutbacks in various operations, such as weather balloon launches. So we know that we've seen eliminated or at least significantly reduced weather balloon launches in at least 8 locations in our more northern stretches of the United States, particularly in Alaska. And we're seeing reduction in our capacity for forecasting. We're seeing reduced access to critical warnings during emergencies, or at least we think that is coming down the pike because many of those folks have been let go. We're also likely to see the effects mostly on underserved areas. We're seeing reductions of meteorologists in general, newspapers, TV, etc. And so these underserved regions are most likely to have take the greatest hits. And so this is primarily our rural communities and our sort of more isolated ag communities. We are likely to see growing concerns. We are seeing growing concerns about relatively wealthy folks who are seem to be wanting to control access to data. We are also seeing growing threats to climate data, not just our regular weather data, but the modeling of climate impacts and what the long-term consequences of climate change are on our ecosystems and society. We're seeing much more political influence on basic research priorities associated with weather. And we're also beginning to see the erosion of international cooperation and data sharing as the U.S. begins to pull out of international data sharing efforts for modeling efforts, for forecasting efforts, etc. The National Weather Service has an annual budget, or this last year, which is being perpetuated through continuing resolutions, has about a $1.3 billion budget, and that translates to about $7 per person in the U.S. per year. And that's a great value. That's a tremendous value that we all get, knowing when the rains are coming, knowing when the fire weather is coming, etc. Many of our weather-dependent industries really rely on that free data. Many of our weather-dependent industries like fishing and farming, etc., really expect to be able to flick on their phone, open up their browser, turn on their television, flick on their radio, and get high-resolution, high-quality forecast data relevant to their industries. If that were to disappear, that would have a significant impact. There would be a real cost for all those industries. We're also likely to, if we were to privatize these data streams, we're likely to see more inequalities in terms of who has access, who doesn't have access to that weather data. So, again, we've had a 155-year evolution of the National Weather Service. It plays a critical role in public safety, in our routine economic goings-on, and even just our daily lives. The threats to the agency's mission and function have been going on for some time, but they are currently unprecedented. So while attacks have gone on for some time, the current attacks are incredibly sophisticated and very effective, and are seeking to dismantle much of what we've built over the last century and a half. There's also very broad implications for science in general and the approach to science in general as we see the erosion or destruction of various elements of the National Weather Service, if not the entirety of the National Weather Service itself. That's a little bit about our current weather collection, and I can't wait for everybody to take a look at the Oxnard office as we go and check that out in our class. A couple questions I have for you to just sort of end up here is, how might privatization of weather services affect different populations? What do you think the optimal balance should be between public and private weather forecasting? And how should scientific agencies navigate the unfolding political pressures and the increasing politicization of science? And lastly, what do you think the value of long-term climate records are? All right. Thanks, you guys.